Thank you for the lovely introduction, Neil, and as you said, it was one of these fortunate encounters that just happened last year, and thankfully I was very grateful to be invited to come here and talk today. It's the sort of nice trip to take just a few weeks after you've turned 31. Even nicer because you've obviously passed that message on to the people in New Zealand, considering I got asked for ID twice last night. It's safe to say that Travis wasn't particularly impressed that he was allowed straight through. So, Neil touched on the sort of things that I'm going to be talking about today, and they're science communication and stem cells. Now, as we're looking at these two things, they're two things that don't necessarily seem to go together that well. But when you think about them a little bit more, they're actually pretty well linked. They're two things that are both incredibly important. They're two things that are both widely misunderstood. And as you can see, they're both SC words. So the purpose of the talk today, and what I hope that you're going to get out of it, is that by the end of it you have some clarity, maybe that we're able to sedate some confusion, and hopefully once we get to our half an hour panel discussion, some scintillating conversation. Now, I went 50-50 when we researched this, but I'm going to change it because I reckon about 20% of the audience now looking around are going, wow, this guy is so clever. Whereas the other 80% of you are starting to have some serious concerns about who they've invited to talk to you today. So let me get on to who I am, just to hopefully start to ease those concerns a little bit. So my name's Brett Drummond. I'm an MS researcher based from Melbourne, Australia, or as I'm led to believe it's known here, the West Island of New Zealand. Just that tiny one off to the side. So my background is in MS research, and I've been involved in MS research for a long time through my undergraduate studies, through to my postgraduate studies. But towards the end of that research space, I really needed to get away from the lab bench for a while, and if you talk to any researchers, they can probably tell you why that is. But having been involved in MS research for a long time, for me it was really important that I stayed involved in the MS community. And so there was this transition into how can I continue to help people with MS without necessarily having to be at the lab bench. And so more recently, I've had a role as a science communicator, and I'm here today really as one of the co-founders of MStranslate. So MStranslate essentially is aiming to do this. So when you're out and you're looking at this, if you're a researcher or someone in the community, when you're hearing about science and trying to read about science, generally with everything you hear, it can be incredibly confusing. What we're trying to do is take that confusion and break it down into something that everyone can understand. And that is really, at its essence, the core goal of MStranslate. It's to bridge the gap that exists between research into multiple sclerosis and people living with MS. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that as we go through. In terms of who we are, MStranslate was formed about 3.5 years ago by myself and my brother Eric. So Eric's background is in web and social media, and it just came about at a time when he was thinking about moving back after having lived for 4 years in the UK. And one of the nice things about being involved in research is that I tended to be in the lab at 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning when it was a perfect time to chat to him. And we started talking about, how could we possibly work together when he came back. And so the idea of being able to take the research background and the science communication background and use his skills in web and social media to disseminate that information is what led to MStranslate. More recently, we've also brought on a third member, Dr. Natalie Thomas, who's a neuroscientist and a science communicator as well, to help us get even more information out. So that's what MStranslate is, that's where it's come from, but what do we actually do? So at its core, what we're doing is we're taking research into MS and providing accurate, independent, easily accessible, and easy to understand summaries of that research. But that's sort of that's the core of what we do, but we go well beyond that. And as you would know, as a community that are very interested in getting this information, there is a lot of information out there. We're certainly not the only ones doing this, but I would like to say that we're one of the best ones doing this, and obviously I'm slightly biased in terms of saying that. But to give some credence to that statement, Gillians, who is a web resource that ranks organisations around the world in terms of information that they're providing on various topics. For multiple sclerosis, MStranslate is ranked number 3 in the world, behind the National MS Society in the US and the Illinois chapter. Now, we're a group of 3 of us in Australia with much lower resources, so for us that's really pleasing to see that the work that we're doing is recognised like that. One of the key differences that separates us, I think, from other things out there is that we're trying to provide information directly from the source. And I'm going to go into after this why that's so important, and why days like this are so important, and why I really commend the MS organisations here for organising days like this. But we want to be able to connect you directly with the source, and so we also do interviews with researchers that are put up. And so today, as part of what we're doing, we're filming these presentations. We're also going to film some shorter interviews with the researchers so that you're hearing this information directly from the people who are doing it. Another thing that makes us somewhat unique is that we do Google Hangouts with researchers. And this is one thing that really mirrors what's happening today, but especially for people living in New Zealand or people living in Australia, we all know that we love where we live, but we are very geographically isolated from the rest of the world. And while there is amazing research being done both here and in Australia, the sheer volume of research being done in Europe and America is phenomenal. So with these Google Hangouts, what we do is we allow people with MS from anywhere in the world to come in and talk to researchers globally. So we've done some Google Hangouts with researchers in America, done them with researchers in Australia, to allow people to come in and interact and ask questions and hear about the research. So again, that's something that we think is really important to provide that connection between community and research directly. Another thing that we're doing is these understanding science articles, and this is something that I feel really passionately about, because we understand that you're not always going to get your information from MStranslate. In fact, probably before today, most of you didn't even know MStranslate existed, but we don't feel like we need to be the sole provider of information, and that's not at all what we want to be. So these understanding science articles are in place so that when you go off and read about other science articles, you have an idea of the sort of things you should be looking for to go, is this a reputable source? Does this data hold up? What are the sort of things that I should be looking for when I'm reading this to go, is this something that I should be interested in, or is this something I should be wary of? And that can be really difficult. And I would love to say that all of the research and all of the science that gets put out on the internet is completely trustworthy and you can just believe everything you read, but unfortunately it's really not the case. The last thing that we do to mirror all of the research is that we provide personal stories and experiences. And again, I think that this is really important because while one of the core aims is to bring research to the community, I think that researchers have a lot to learn from the community, and we have a lot that we can gain from the community itself. And this has happened a number of times already when we do these sorts of things. As an example, we held a Google Hangout with a member of a researcher at the Melbourne Brain Centre back in Melbourne. And through that conversation with a person with MS, they were asking some questions, telling them about their own personal experiences. And the researcher went away after that and said, I never knew that was a thing. And they've given me some excellent ideas that now I can implement into my research. So this is definitely not a one-way street. This isn't just about providing information to people with MS. This is to help research. Because, and I say this a lot when I talk to people, I would like to think I know multiple sclerosis pretty well, having been involved in researching it for almost on 10 years now. But I know multiple sclerosis from a science level, from a pathological level, from a cell level. I don't have MS, and the only people who really know what MS is the people that are living with it. And so we as researchers have so much to gain from that interaction as well. And so I find that is also a really important part of what we do. So in terms of where we are, we have our website, and we have our social media channels on Facebook, on Twitter, and we also have a YouTube channel. I won't talk too much about this, but the important part of our social media channels is that this allows for discussion and interaction with the community. Because one of the things that we note, again, as a point of difference between what's out there, is that putting information out there is only 20%, 30% of the job. And I almost feel like it's a responsibility, if you're going to put information out there, that you're then willing to engage in a discussion about it. Because while we try and simplify things down to a level that we think is easy enough to understand, and my brother not having a science background is my guinea pig for everything that we write, people are always going to have questions about it, and that may be questions of, can you explain this more? Or, this is great, can I have some more details? And if you're not there to actually interact on that level, then I think you're doing a disservice, and it's almost irresponsible to be putting that information out there. So, what I want to get to now, and this is now the next part of the talk really, is why do we need this? Why is science communication important? And the quote here, perhaps that is the secret, it's not what we do so much as why we do it, I think really holds up. And this is obviously by a very famous man, Tyrion Lannister, from Game of Thrones, if anyone is a big Game of Thrones fan. So the first question, in terms of why have I started MStranslate? The big question that I always get asked is there a personal connection to it? And the easy answer to that is no. I don't have MS. I don't have a close relative or family member with MS. For me, it has been being involved in the system, doing research for a very long time. You become attached in a way, and I now just feel very passionately about continuing to contribute to MS. It's also MS, and it's one of the most difficult things for researchers in terms of how variable it is for everyone, and I'm sure everyone in this room will know exactly what I'm talking about more than me, but as someone who enjoys puzzles, there is no greater puzzle out there at the moment than multiple sclerosis. The next question that gets asked, and this is asked in sort of two ways, is are you doing it for the money, or how do you get money? And the answer to both of those questions is really the same thing, and that's no. Because as I joke with researchers, I'm pretty sure science communication is the one area that is harder to get funding for than research itself. And so essentially for the entire 3.5 years that MStranslate has been in existence, we've been unfunded for the work that we've done as MStranslate. We've done a couple of other side projects, but essentially MStranslate is completely unfunded. So why do we do it, and why is this important? So this is you can tell that I'm not a graphic designer. This is my really fancy graphic that I put together to explain what I found things were like while I was doing research, and why I think we needed a change. So as researchers, when you're communicating about your research, generally you're putting that information into scientific journals. And for researchers, that's really important. It leads to them getting more funding, more grants, recognition. But that's not really filtering down to the community if you don't have a science background. Even sometimes when you do, if you're reading a journal article, 90% of it might go over your head. So doctors might be reading journal articles and they'll be able to get some information about this, but doctors and neurologists are extremely busy. As an example, last year around 4,000 scientific articles were published on MS alone. Someone who doesn't have a lot of time, like a doctor or a neurologist, they can't stay on top of all of that information. They also may not have a scientific background, and again, so that might make it difficult for them to completely understand what's going on. So as a member of the community, as a person with MS, where were you getting your information from about the research that was going on? You might have been getting some filtering through from your doctors or your neurologists, or mainly you were getting your information from the media. And as we discussed last night when we were talking about this, I probably should have another little circle over here talking about where the media get their information from, and that's just a variety of sources. that can pose a lot of problems, which we're going to go into now. So a couple of weeks before I came over here, John Oliver, who if you don't know does a show in the US called Last Week Tonight, did a whole piece about scientific studies, and a big focus on this was how it's covered in the media. And so instead of going through it myself and giving you all of these specific examples, I just have a short clip here from him talking about one example that you might see as to why getting all of your information from the media about research can be bad.
For all those reasons, scientists themselves know not to attach too much significance to individual studies until they're placed in the much larger context of all the work taking place in that field. But too often, a small study with nuanced, tentative findings gets blown out of all proportion when it's presented to us, the lay public. Sometimes that happens when a scientific body puts out a press release summarising the study for a wider audience. For instance, earlier this year, a medical society hosted a conference at which a paper was presented comparing the effects of high and low flavanol chocolate during pregnancy. If that sounds narrow and technical, it was supposed to be. There wasn't even a control group of women who didn't eat chocolate, and the study found no difference in preeclampsia or high blood pressure between women who ate the two chocolates. So there is no way a study that boring can make it to television, right? Well, wait. Because that medical society issued a press release with the much sexier but pretty misleading title, The Benefits of Chocolate During Pregnancy. And because most TV producers just read press releases, this happens.
Turns out if you're pregnant, eating 30 grams a day of chocolate, that's about 2/3 of a chocolate bar, not the whole chocolate bar, could improve blood flow to the placenta and benefit the growth and development of your baby, especially in women at risk for preeclampsia or high blood pressure in pregnancy.
Except that's not what the study said. It's like a game of telephone. The substance gets distorted at every step. And I can only imagine how someone who watched that segment must have described it the next day. Oh, the news said our baby is made of chocolate and it's okay if I eat it, but only 2/3.
Do not eat babies, they are not made of chocolate. That is not my takeaway message from the talk today. But this is just a fine example of what can happen. Researchers publish their articles in scientific journals. Generally, if it's an interesting study, and sometimes potentially when it's not, institutes will want to put out press releases about this. This is our first layer of dilution. And as you can see, they're putting out press releases that are trying to grab attention, okay? Once that then gets taken on by people who don't necessarily know the science, you get things like this being reported in the media. If you're only getting your information from the media, you can see how this can start to spiral. So this is one of the key reasons why science communication is really important. To give you an MS-specific example of this, oh no, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. So one of the other real things that's important is that if we start cherry-picking studies, and like you talked about at the start of that, if you're just looking at studies in isolation, scientists tend not to do where we put things into the broader perspective. But if you're just looking at individual studies that may gain media attention, you could be getting a very distorted view of what's going on. And this was a graphic that was also used in that John Oliver sketch, looking at different parts of our diet and studies suggesting whether or not they protect against cancer or whether or not they cause cancer. What you can see for all of these different things is that there are a number of studies that suggest they protect, a number of studies that say that they cause. And that's not to mean that we don't necessarily understand anything about this, okay? And it's not important to say, the outcome of this is, well, we have no idea whether coffee causes cancer or doesn't cause cancer. But when you're looking at things at this sort of level, you don't know about the details of these studies, what sort of cancers they're talking about, or any of those sorts of things. And so it can, again, this is the sort of problems that we can have when we're talking about science communication in the media. So when we're talking about an MS-specific example, so this was a study done in the US that gained some media attention at the start of this year. So probably all aware about the benefits that vitamin D might have for people with MS, and there's exciting studies going on about this at the moment, and Australia and New Zealand have got the Prevan study going on at the moment, which we're hopeful that we'll see some really interesting results for. But so this study done by some researchers in America got some media coverage, and And this is the headline from the Australian article that said vitamin D could cut multiple sclerosis symptoms, then underneath saying vitamin D could reverse symptoms of MS. Now, this was in the media. The problem is we're saying that once this is in the media, it starts to spiral. Okay, and so this was then shared by a major MS organisation suggesting the same things. They've possibly given a little bit more detail here as to whether or not we should be mindful of what's going on. You can see that this is then liked by 300 people, shared by 120 people, and this snowball effect goes on. Now, is that bad? Well, no, not necessarily if that's what the study showed. But let me show you what we ran with on MStranslate as our headline. Effects of high-dose vitamin D in people with MS. Now, I grant you that is not anywhere near as sexy a title. And if you're seeing that, you're probably not that interested in necessarily clicking on it to begin with. But the thing was that I went in and read that study, read the actual scientific article, and these were the outcomes as they said them in the study from the research that they'd done. There were two. They said that high-dose vitamin D therapy was safe in people with MS. That was their first thing that they were looking at. Secondly, that they showed that high-dose vitamin D therapy appeared to have an effect on the immune system. And that the immune cells that were affected by this were immune cells that we have evidence that suggests they're involved in causing damage in MS. So can we take that and go, well, look, potentially, yes, this could have a clinical impact and could have an impact on symptoms? Sure. Is that what the study showed, though? Is that what I would be running with as my headline? No. Okay, because they didn't look at any sort of clinical outcomes of this at all. Purely looked at the effect on the immune system. And so, you know, it's this balance. We need to get people interested in research. We want people to be listening and finding out what's going on. But you also have to give a realistic picture of what's going on, and that's what's really important. So this now goes on to the next part of the talk, and talking about stem cell therapy in MS. And if there's one thing that suffers or has suffered recently from media treatment, I would say it's stem cell therapy in MS, because you get... The problem is all of these research studies don't necessarily appear in the media, but when we get these sort of stories, these are the ones that are going to turn up. And so you get headlines that say things like, miracle treatment cures student with multiple sclerosis. Okay, and we've seen on TV in Australia, we've seen some Today Tonight ran a story on a guy who went to Russia, had stem cell therapy done, and was in a wheelchair before his treatment, and then was in the gym and running through the park afterwards. Okay, so you have those sort of stories. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you get stories that have this very negative vibe about them. You know, stem cell tourism gains popularity despite the risks, talking about all of the dangers that are involved. So you've got things on either end of the spectrum, but there's really nothing in the middle. And really it's that in the middle bit that's really important. So really what I'm going to be going through today is just, and we can talk more about this during question time, but for the sake of the talk and the time, I'm really just going through a couple of the key points as to what we're talking about here when we're talking about stem cell therapy. So the first thing is, when we're talking about stem cell therapy, and the main stem cell therapy that we're talking about at the moment for people with MS is this HSCT or AHSCT, okay? And in this case, stem cell therapy is almost a little bit of a misnomer. Really what we're talking about here is bone marrow transplants. Okay, that is essentially what we're talking about. Are there stem cells involved? Yes, but don't get confused with this with other stem cell therapies that are going on. Okay, and one of the biggest points that I'm going to make as we're going through this is understanding that we can't just use the term stem cell therapy in a one-size-fits-all sort of way. So the A part of this, autologous, it stands from the fact that what you're doing is taking out your own cells and reintroducing them. Okay, so this is different from having a donor. And essentially at the moment, all of the MS trials really that have been done for this are using your own stem cells, just because once you start introducing a donor, the sort of safety risks that are involved increase. And we're looking at, for this, hematopoietic stem cells. So what are hematopoietic stem cells? So stem cells in general are cells that retain an ability in your body to differentiate into a variety of cell types. Hematopoietic stem cells are these cells that can then lead to all of the cells that make up your immune system. Okay? So that's the type of thing that we're looking at doing here. This is essentially what's going on in a bone marrow transfer. So what happens as part of this process is that you will have stem cells removed or bone marrow removed, generally from a very painful procedure that involves a very large needle going into your hip. Those stem cells are collected and frozen, and then you have one of a variety of different conditioning treatments. Okay, and again, this is one of the key points that I'm going to make, because this is one of the things that if you are interested in this sort of treatment, that's one of the key things that you need to understand, is what are the conditioning treatments that are going on, and there's a variety of them. Generally, it's some form of chemotherapy of varying levels of toxicity or varying levels of severity. Some studies will also use total body irradiation on top of this. The whole point of this process is to completely wipe out your bone marrow and the existing cells that are there. And so this is what's happening. This intensive chemotherapy is designed to delete your destructive immune system. So we probably all have an awareness that one of the overriding theories behind multiple sclerosis is that there's this autoimmune component to it. Your immune system is causing the damage, damaging the myelin. So by doing this intensive chemotherapy, what's happening is that we're deleting all of those autoreactive immune cells. Giving the transfer then is designed to reboot the immune system. So essentially putting these cells back in, theoretically back in at a time before they were aggressive. Essentially taking you back to a time before you had MS. That's the theory. Giving you this reboot, so no damage. No new damage. The last really important point that I want to make on this for now is that when we talk about, is this sort of stem cell therapy a cure? I would say it's definitely not a cure. It really depends, I guess, on how you define a cure. In your best case scenario, what's happening here is that you're stopping your disease progression because you're stopping that autoimmune response. You're not getting any repair of existing damage from what's going on here. Okay, because with these type of stem cells, there are different stem cell trials that are going on that are looking at that sort of thing, but this sort of stem cell trial, these stem cells aren't going to go in and repair any damaged myelin. So, what does that mean to someone sitting here who may be, thinking about stem cell therapy or what's going on? How do you make those decisions? And I'm probably going to skip to the third point here first before I go back to the other ones. And I think this is true of anything. This isn't just true of HSCT or anything, but you need to ask questions, and more importantly, you need to find the best information available. And so when I've talked, we have a number of members of the MStranslate community who have gone and had HSCT done. One of the key things that they've said, and it's not biasing either way in terms of, yes, you should get this, no, you shouldn't, but it's that you really need to go through the process of finding out that information. And this may come from a variety of different sources. For example, one of the things that we've heard is that in terms of getting the best information about, is this going to be beneficial for me? Your neurologist is the best person to talk to, whereas if you want to talk about the risks, then you're looking at a hematologist. This was just some experiences that we've heard from people, but I can't stress enough how important it is to get the information that you need. For example, looking into what sort of conditioning regimes may be going on in the place where you're going to be going to have this done. What's been shown so far in the trials that have been done? It's really hard to say, is my honest answer to this. So, have there been people that have reported benefits from having this done? Yes. Have there been people who have reported no benefits from having this done? Yes. How much can we read into the chances of this being a successful therapy for a person? it's really difficult to answer that, and there are a number of reasons why that is. Essentially, all of the trials that have been done so far have been done in really small numbers of people in single-centre studies. And single-centre studies, as scientists, that what we're looking for is being done across a number of different sites so that we can take out any bias that may exist. The other big thing that none of these studies have done so far is that they haven't been placebo-controlled. Now, the placebo effect is a very real thing. And so while we're saying that people have got benefits from this without having that information, it's really hard to say whether or not necessarily that's a real benefit from the procedure or due to placebo effect. The question is, if you're feeling better, does it matter? Don't know, but really to be able to assess anything about the science of this, we would need to have that sort of information. There are the differences that seem to occur between these studies really appear to be dependent on the selection criteria that people have used for the people that they've done the therapies on. And so the suggestions at the moment, and again I would say that the science isn't necessarily concrete on this at all, so it definitely isn't, is that the people who seem, or what the suggestion is in the literature at the moment, is that the people who will see the most benefits from this are people early in disease with an aggressive disease. There are some statements that say that progressive people won't necessarily benefit from this treatment at all. Again, I wouldn't say that's completely conclusive yet, but that's one of the things that's being talked about at the moment. It's important to realise that there are obviously safety risks that do exist with this sort of treatment, okay? In terms of the chemotherapy, potentially the radiation that's going on, what you're doing is putting yourself in a position where for a period of time you're going to have a compromised immune system, okay? And obviously that's the point of the study itself. Again, this is going to be dependent on the sort of study that you get. You can't just say that one type of stem cell therapy is going to have the same sort of risks as every other type. So that's why it's really important to get that sort of information. In the end, I think it's a personal decision, okay? And it's based on weighing up all of the pros and cons, but as I say, that's why it's particularly important to find the best information. So to sort of finish up, and I hope what's become clear is that this sort of system doesn't work, and we need a change from this, because for so many reasons, as a community of people with MS, you need to be getting access to the best information to know what's going on in the research world, because there are really exciting things going on. So what we're hoping we're being able to achieve a little bit through MStranslate is going from that model to this model, where we can help bring all members of this MS community together, be it organisations, media, journals, all so that people in the community can benefit. And that's really what I hope that we're trying to achieve, and I hope that you can see that there is some benefit from what we're doing. So that's what we do, that's what we can provide for people with MS. But I want to finish up, and this is going to lead into Travis's talk. If you haven't met Travis, here he is, he's also down here. So this all came about, and the reason Travis is here is that he kindly answered an email that I sent him late last year as well, saying I'm really interested in your research, would you be happy to have a chat? I think people with MS would be really interested to hear about it. And one of the things that we talked about when we did this interview is, this is what we're doing, but how can people with MS help? What can people with MS be doing? And this is something that Travis is going to talk about as well, and this is just what I want to finish with. So I'm just going to, no, apparently you're pretty good, doesn't want to play. No, you can talk about it. You're just going to get to look at Travis. He's not going to say anything, but the point of this is, and this doesn't matter hugely because I'm probably running out of time anyway, but if I can leave you with one thought, there are things that we can do, and as researchers and as science communicators, trust me when I say we are working overtime to do everything that we can to try and help you guys. But do not, and this is my overriding message, do not underestimate the power that you have as the MS community to alter the landscape of research. You are the most powerful force that exists in terms of getting research to progress. Okay, so your voices and speaking up for the things that you want to happen in research, getting excited about research that's going on, that is what is going to drive research forward, and that is what is going to help things that you want to see happen. We're a little bit restricted in the things that we do. You guys have all of the power, and trust me when I say that the difference that you can make to research is immense. And so that's really the last thing that I want to leave you with. So just in closing, you can say it yourself. I won't, you can just say it. I've probably talked long enough. So just in closing, I'd really like to thank MS Auckland and MS Research Trust for the invitation to come and talk here today. Obviously the rest of the MStranslate's team who's back on the West Island who couldn't make the trip. John Oliver for essentially summing up what I wanted to say in a funnier way than I could ever do it. Travis for giving me a video clip where he didn't speak. And really, lastly and most importantly, thank you to all of you, because without you, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing. There is no MStranslate without an MS community. So I thank you all for your continued interest in research, the passion that you as a community have for research and finding out information.